Good evening. Have you ever filled a saucer with the light from a sunset? Have you ever vaulted a saucer in the air to shine in the light of the setting sun? They say that when this happens, the saucer transforms into a living creature called a saucer dragon. But who are they who say this? Of course, it's the saucer dragons. And they always seem to make such claims right before sunset. Some brief announcements from Ufos. My apologies for delaying the show. This was due to my own incompetence, abduction. All joking aside, though, I do sincerely apologize. Also, Ufo Sunset will only occur from now on once every 2 weeks and not only under the right atmospheric conditions like rare orbs of dusk. But do not fret, solitary viewer. There will still be, or rather, there will now be, a show every week because we will now have a discussion episode that is a response or part 2 for each previous Ufos episode, where we'll talk about the last episode of Ufos, eventually have interviews, and also spend time responding to people in the chat. What happens when high-velocity arcs of plasma strike the ground? What happens when cuckoos are caught in the nest of the wrong bird? Over and over again, many times over many, many generations, again and again beyond all human imagining. What happened to Jan Wolski in Emilchin, Poland in 1978? And how does the mythology surrounding UFOs relate to the conscious and unconscious minds of humanoids? All this and more tonight. I'm Rachel Nelson.
I'm Jeff Knox.
I'm Luis Cayetano.
Welcome to UFO Sunset. And now for the rebrief. A giant disc-shaped fish washed ashore in Oregon. On Monday, a giant rare fish called the hoodwinker sunfish was found washed ashore in the small city of Gerhardt on the northernmost portion of the Oregon coast, according to the Associated Press. The hoodwinker sunfish was only first described in 2017 in a paper with lead author Marianne Nygaard, who resides in Auckland, New Zealand. Nygaard and others discovered the new species by examining the genetics and morphology of specimens. This was the first time that a new sunfish species was described in 125 years. The new species, named Mola tecta, is closely related to the more common ocean sunfish, Mola mola. The hoodwinker sunfish was previously thought to reside in the ocean waters of the southern hemisphere, although another reportedly washed ashore in California in 2019. Nygaard examined photographs of the sunfish in Oregon and said that it is a hoodwinker sunfish, adding that it may be the largest specimen ever found. The fish measures 7.3 feet in length. According to the Seaside Aquarium, the sunfish has remained on the beach and is likely to still be there for a few more days or possibly even a few weeks. Cuckoo parasitism increases their biodiversity, according to a recent study. Some cuckoos, like the different species of bronze cuckoos in Australia, New Zealand, and in nearby island regions, engage in a behavior called brood parasitism, where they place their eggs in the nests of other birds. When the cuckoo eggs hatch, the cuckoos push out the other nestlings and get raised in their place. A new study published in Science on Thursday before last found that brood parasitism helps drive the evolution of new cuckoo species. Bronze cuckoo hatchlings will resemble the hatchlings of their host parents due to selective pressures. Meanwhile, the host birds, small songbirds, are selectively pressured to recognize differences between their own hatchlings and those of parasite cuckoos. The new study uses 2 decades of research into cuckoo behavior, as well as genetic data, and finds that brood parasitism drives the generation of more new species. The authors also found that bronze cuckoos tend to evolve into new species at a greater rate than less parasitic and non-parasitic species of cuckoos from the same regions. They also find that hosts recognizing and pushing out parasitic cuckoo hatchlings drives the microevolution and speciation of brood parasitic cuckoos. Study lead Naomi Langmore from the Australian National University said, quote, "Cuckoos are very costly to their hosts, so hosts have evolved the ability to recognize and eject cuckoo chicks from their nests," unquote, according to Cambridge University. Langmore added, quote, "Only the cuckoos that most resemble the host's own chicks have any chance of escaping detection. So, over many generations, the cuckoo chicks have evolved to mimic the host chicks," unquote. The Devil Comet has arrived near Earth. Comet 12P Pons Brooks made its closest approach to Earth last Sunday, according to CNN. Also called the Devil Comet, it gets its nickname from its pronged horn-like tail, but it is officially named for Jean-Louis Pons and William Robert Brooks, who first documented the comet in 1812 and 1883 respectively. The comet has an orbit of 71 years. It made its closest approach to the Sun on April 21st at about 74 million miles. Though the Devil Comet hasn't been visible in the Northern Hemisphere since early May, it may be seen by skywatchers in the Southern Hemisphere, in the constellation Canis Majoris, using binoculars or a telescope. The comet is currently about 230 million kilometers or 145 million miles from Earth. Live Science reported that on Monday, astrophotographers photographed the Devil Comet from Namibia and were able to capture a rare optical phenomenon called an anti-tail, a tail of reflected light extending in front of the comet's path. And now for Mr. Jeff Knox.
Hello. Today we're going to be talking about the Emerson abduction, or the Jan Wolski case. And this is a case that actually involves real little green men. You hear little green men joked about a lot, but this case involves real little green men. And it's perhaps inaccurate to call it an abduction, since he wasn't actually taken. He encountered these beings and entered the craft on his own volition and then left. In this case, it took place in Emerson. Let's see, how do we... Okay, there we go. In Emelchin, Poland. Oh, and I want to apologize in advance. This is a Polish case, and so a lot of the literature is in Polish, and I only had access to the material that I could get in English or that I could translate, and I also don't speak Polish, so I apologize in advance for butchering the names here. It's kind of a difficult language, I think, in my opinion. But Emelchin was basically, it's a small town or a village. It had about 72 farms in Poland. It was in the Opolu-Lubelski commune area of Poland. It was so small, it didn't have, there was no newsstands. There was only one shop in this village. There was no pubs or clubs or like restaurants to eat at. In fact, the whole town apparently only had 2 televisions and a couple of radios. And so that's the kind of the context of that area, an emerald sheen. This is a kind of a map of the area to keep in mind as I explain the case to you. This guy was basically walking through this meadow here when he ended up encountering these beings, and this meadow is sort of near his house. But let's kind of just get on to the case here. And I want to thank, I took a comic here that was created by a famous Polish artist, Grzegorz Rydzyński, called Prisbiz. And I took all the Polish language and I took it out and I translated it and I tried to fix things as best as I could. But like I said, I don't speak Polish, so I fixed the stuff that Google Translate that was obviously incorrect. I didn't bother to change any like grammar or tense errors or things like that. So I apologize, but the comic is legible and it's in English now. So that's where these illustrations come from, if you're wondering. So it's early May 10th, 1978, and Jan Wolski, who's a 71-year-old farmer, is returning home to the village of Emelson from Dubrowa with this horse-drawn cart. He decides to cut through the field on his property in order that he might get back to his cottage sooner. And there's one other thing I want to point out about this case is there's a lot of conflicting information. I mean, an amazing amount of conflicting information on this case. The details I'm sharing with you are generally the right structure that they all share, but when it comes to the specific details, there's a lot of variation in why things happened. A different source reports that the reason that he was cutting through the field was actually because this mare did not have the right type of shoe to travel on the hard road surface, and so that's why he was cutting through this field. And there's a lot of discrepancies like this depending on the sources. In fact, almost every source has completely different information. So keep that in mind. So he's riding through this village and cutting through this field that's near his property. He was originally on this road, like I said, that was a road from Dubrowa to Lublin, between Lublin and Opolu Lubelski. And he turned off this road onto this kind of like narrow kind of dirt path that cut through these trees near his property. And as he's riding along this path with these mares through these trees and brushes, he notices these 2 people walking in front of him. And at first he thinks that there must be hunters from like a nearby camp. And these beings, they were kind of walking, he said, in a way that kind of resembled like supple jumps, like divers, kind of like an open ocean floor, or perhaps like you might imagine an astronaut's like on the moon. This kind of like fluent, kind of like smooth jumping motion is the way these beings or entities were walking. As he got near them, they each stepped kind of to one side of his cart and then jumped into his cart as he passed, sitting behind him, which apparently is, a fairly common thing to do in the country, to catch a ride on someone's cart. Wolski is not frightened, and so he turns around slightly to face them, and he notices these 2 short, green-faced, black-eyed humanoid entities, about 5 feet tall, are sitting there. At first, he mistakes them for foreigners because of their slanted eyes and prominent cheekbones. In fact, he thought they were sort of like the Chinese. But they were different because they had this green skin. They also had this hump on their neck that he's just kind of like you rolled up like a towel and put it cut around the neck. They had this hump or a lump there. They also report they had a web-like fin between their fingers up to the first joint, amphibian-like. However, I will point out that that may, in fact, be a false detail because, as we've seen in cases like Socorro, they actually inserted bogus details into this case in order to determine if there was copycats or people that were making up stories later on. And apparently one of these bogus details was the fin-like structure between the fingers. Another detail that you'll see in some of the illustrations was like a circular kind of a shape emblem on the chest or breast area of the creatures. Apparently those are made up in order to pull people off. But some of the sources do report this this pattern, and the comic reports it, but again, the comic gets kind of a lot of details wrong as well. But overall, they were these short, 5 feet tall creatures. They had this green-like skin, and they were wearing this tight-fitting black suit that covered them from the head to the toe, kind of like a diver suit. But apparently, Wolski wasn't really aware of what a diver suit was. Wolski was he was pretty uneducated. He only went to a couple of years of primary school when he was a child, so he didn't go through a whole lot of school. He had almost never left this village. He had went on vacation once, I guess, around World War II. He went to Ukraine, I guess. But he was a pretty isolated guy, and he was not a very educated guy. And like I said, he didn't get a lot of like news or media, and so he wasn't supposedly familiar what a diver suit was. Now, these entities are kind of speaking to each other in a fast-paced voice that he could not understand. It sounded kind of like a ta-ta-ta-ta-ta-ta. And he said it was so fast that he couldn't really understand how they could be communicating with each other, how they could understand each other, because it was almost just kind of like a stutter, almost like a blur of speaking. And so anyway, so these entities are kind of behind him, and they're sitting behind him, and they're facing kind of away, the legs kind of hanging off the side of the craft. And they continue down this path with his mare until they reach this clearing ahead. Now, when Wolski reaches this clearing, he's surprised to find this large kind of white object, kind of cuboid object, hovering about 16 feet up into the air. It's about 15 to 16 feet high and about as long as a bus, but he says it's like a short bus, not like the long buses we have now, but like a short bus. And on this craft, there's these 4 cylindrical or barrel-shaped objects in the corners that contain these large screw thread-like rotating poles that are moving very fast. They're generating a humming sound resembling that of a transformer, or he says a swarm of bees. And apparently, when these poles are hovering or spinning around, kind of like a drill bit, they give off some kind of like coloring, some strange effervescent kind of coloring around them. When they're about 20 meters from the object, or rather about 60 feet of the object, one of the entities indicates for him to stop the cart. Now, keep in mind they can't communicate verbally, like they can't understand each other. So everything like the Simonton case and many other cases is indicated basically with hand gestures. And so when they're about 60 feet away from this object, one of these entities tells him to stop the cart. And apparently his mare has quite kind of like the attitude and doesn't like to stop unless it wants to stop. And so apparently one of these entities grabs the reins and helps him stop the mare so they can stop the cart. Wolski then secures the mare and follows the beans up to this craft. Now, a platform descends to the ground from the object, and they indicate for Wolski to get on the platform. Now, depending on the sources, the platform is either already on the ground when they got there, or it descended to the ground when they walked up to approach it. And there's also conflicting detail about as far as who got on the platform here. Some of the sources say Wolski got on the platform and one of the beings got on the platform. The other turned back around to check out his mare and to investigate it. Other sources say they both got on the platform. So like I said, it's different details depending on the source here. But so he gets on this platform and he's lifted up into the craft in an instant with one of these beings, which is most of the sources agree it was one being that went up on the craft with him on that platform. And this platform is basically, it looks like it's just like a plank that is lifted up on these wires. It's just a simple lift. When he gets to the top, which he says happened in an instant, almost like it didn't even remember it happening. He said it was just so quick, like it was at the bottom and he was at the top. And when he gets to the top there, he steps into the craft through the small doorway. He immediately notices there are 2 more entities inside the craft that look just like the entities he met on the ground, holding these 2 small bulb-like objects. The room is dark. There are no lights or windows in the craft, only the daylight that comes through the door. The interior wall is black with a grayish tint, similar to that of the creature's outfits, with an almost plastic or bakelite appearance to it. The only objects are about 8 to 10 benches situated around the craft. These benches are held up by these kind of wires, just like the lift was, and they appear to be big enough to sit about one person each. The doorway was very strange. It didn't have any hinges like you would expect on a door. Instead, it rolled up like a piece of carpet would. One of the entities that came in with him indicated for Wolski to strip his clothes. He starts to remove his jacket, his sweater, his shirt, until he has removed the top half of his clothing. He thought that would be enough, but they indicated for him to strip everything off. Wolski is then examined with a tool that resembles the 2 dishes or saucers. This tool makes a soft vibrating or buzzing sound as he is thoroughly checked out. And he explains that he thinks it's kind of almost like maybe it's a camera or something that's taking images or snapshots of him as they inspect him. Now, while they're examining Wolski, the entities start to eat something that looks kind of like icicles, like an icicle that might be hanging off your roof, but it's soft, kind of like cake. They're able to break it off, easily and smoothly. And they offer him a piece of it, but he refuses. So after finishing the examination, they then instruct Wolski to get dressed. The beings find his belt particularly fascinating, playing with the buckle mechanism, perhaps curious about its function. They buckle it and rebuckle it and unbuckle it repeatedly, which is kind of interesting. Sorry, I lost my place there. And as he's about to leave, he notices on the ground near where he came in, there's some rooks, which are they're ravens or crows. I guess they're called rooks in like that part of Poland and in various other places. And in front of this door. And one of these rooks seems to be moving its legs and wings, but it seems to be immobilized, like it can't really move or fly. And there's 8 to 10 or a dozen or something of these like immobilized birds just kind of there on the ground. And on the wall next to the immobilized birds are these 2 holes. One of these beings is holding a small band in his hand. And this tool is basically like a stick, and he says it looks kind of like a raspberry head on the end or like a ball on the end. And he sticks this tool into the holes and turns it as if he's making an adjustment. He does it in the one hole, then he does it in the other hole. And that's all we kind of hear about that. I don't know what the adjustment was supposed to be, but it's really, those 2 holes and those benches are the only things in that entire craft. Supposedly there's like a kind of a conduit that looks like it kind of goes along the ceiling. But aside from that, there's no instrumentation, there's no panels, there's no like control system, there's nothing to indicate like it was any sort of kind of machinery. It was like an empty room with the seat, basically. Now Wolski is dressed, and they indicate that he can leave. As he returns to the lift, he turns around and bows to the entities, wishing them goodbye. Because apparently, like I said, he wasn't afraid this whole time, and he thought these were, they were nice, they treated him well, and so he wanted to be polite and wish them goodbye. I have to say, personally, I'm not sure where he gets off thinking they treated him well. This guy met some strange creatures. They made him come into his craft and get naked and then sent him on his way. If that's treating you well, I don't know. But anyways, so he thought they were these very nice, pleasant beings, and so he wanted to wish them goodbye, and so he did. They mimic his motions and return with his bow with a smile or kind of like a grimace. He goes on this lift, and again, just like when he got on the lift, he was down at the bottom in almost an instant. Some reports say it didn't quite go all the way to the bottom. He had to jump off the lift to get to the rest of the ground. But he's back on the ground, and he's walking back over to his horse or his mare. At this point, he estimates he's been in the craft about 10 minutes based on the amount of grass the mare has eaten. Wolski is anxious to return home to his family and kind of tell them the story, to notify them what happened, and urging them to see if perhaps they could get out and see the floating craft himself before they left. Now, his sons, I'll point out this event I mentioned happened in the morning. Supposedly it happened around, he first saw these creatures about 7:20, 7:15, 7:20 in the morning. And they say he got back home at around a 7:45 till 8. Some reports say 8. And again, this is where these details vary. There's other reports that say he didn't get home until 10:30, and another about an alarm clock he saw that said it was 12:30. So depending on the sources, this incident happened anywhere between 10 minutes and like 3.5 hours or more. So most of them have it being a fairly short encounter, and Wolski himself in 1985 would say it was only about 10 to 15 minutes on the craft. I guess if you take the time with when he first saw these beings, maybe add another 5-10 minutes. So he gets back, and his sons call on some of the neighbors, and together they decide to go investigate the site. The grass where the craft had been hovering had shown signs of usage, being trodden down and covered with dew and past coming in all directions. Wolski returns home, leaving the rest of his neighbors and family at the site. Wolski's sons claimed they would also find footprints left by the beings, but could not describe them in much detail. Now, whether these this trodden down paths in the grass were from these beings or from visitors and the village people visiting the site, that'll be something you'll have to decide. Either way, there wasn't much they could do with the trace cases. Like I said, it was a heavily visited site. At one point, there was supposedly up to 14 busloads of people visiting the site in the time after the incident. Later, a 6-year-old boy from the village would claim also to have witnessed a bus-like craft with green-faced occupants hover over a barn at about the same time, at about 8:10 in the morning, before it would climb into the sky and vanish. And that's actually a photo of the boy in one of the television documentaries. This incident caused a lot of commotion in the local village. The local town's people, particularly the children, apparently got quite scared. Like I said, this is a small village, and the children, it sounds cliche, but literally had to walk 2 kilometers through the forest in order to get to school every morning. And so apparently these children became quite concerned that maybe they would be abducted by these UFO occupants. And so the local headmaster for the school and this physics teacher they had there decided to try to teach kind of some critical thinking to the students, just kind of calm them down and kind of put a lid on this. And they also kind of spent some time teaching them about space sciences and life in the universe, and that we haven't really discovered it yet. And I guess they spent a lot of time kind of praising the Soviet space developments of the time as well. But apparently it was ineffective, and there were still students skipping school. So the headmaster of this school decided to inform the local militia. And so he called in the local militia to the village in order to investigate the case, hoping that they would be able to just explain it away as like a helicopter or something natural, and that would be the end of that. And so they come into the village and they investigate, but they find no evidence to actually back up Wolski's extraordinary tale. The police determined that he probably dreamt the whole scenario up in his sleep in sort of like a waking dream. And if you recall, the Joe Simonton pancake case I spoke about a couple of months ago, it basically had the very similar explanation, that it was essentially a waking dream that this guy kind of integrated into his reality and confused for being real. Now, Wolski, of course, would claim that was not possible because he was wide awake at the time. Apparently, he had been escorting somebody who was new and unfamiliar to the village shortly before this incident happened. And because of his company, he was on constant alert and paying attention to his surroundings. The comic says that, again, I cannot confirm any other sources that mention this person he was supposedly escorting. But again, the main books on the case are in Polish, and I don't have them. So maybe they discuss it in there. And Wolski, again, they also say he didn't drink alcohol. They say he was a teetotaler. He didn't drink. and that he was a very honest man that would not make up such a story, that he was a God-fearing Catholic, and that made it impossible that he would produce a story like this. Also, the fact that, again, this is a Soviet-controlled Poland at the time, and reporting a fake story or a lie to waste the malicious time may not be a good idea. Okay. Still, it's hard to determine what the exact nature of Wolski's story is. The main actors in this case have already passed away, and they've been dead for quite a while now. If you recall, Wolski was 71 when this event happened in 1978. He would pass away in 1991. Zbigniew Blania Bolnar died in 2003. There have been multiple explanations offered for this case. However, one of them, of course, I already mentioned, was perhaps that was a helicopter. The local, police or the Soviets were doing some sort of exercise, the militia was, and he confused the incident for a helicopter. Some say Wolski himself was an avid storyteller and that he enjoyed the attention that came with his UFO story, that he would give people tours around the site where he allegedly encountered these beings and their craft, which is it's interesting because, again, there's also contradictory information on this, conflicting information that states that it annoyed him having to kind of do this, that his grounds were being trampled by all these visitors, and that he wished he hadn't told this story. But I would have to say, based on his actions, that's just not true. He seemed very interested in telling this story to anyone that wanted to hear it when he was still alive, and he, would speak at UFO conferences, and he did not live the life of a person that felt like he didn't want to tell this story and he wished he hadn't told this story. So take from that kind of what you will. Others claim, in fact, that he had been drugged and hallucinated this entire incident. In an alternate version of this story, the entire affair was actually kind of a scripted plot by the communist regime to divert public attention away from the economy at the time, which I guess was in the dumps. And given the widespread news coverage at the time and the fact that the Soviet media was not independent, it was government controlled, one could make an argument that there was some reason why they chose to give this story so much publicity and attention at the time. In fact, it was really the first major UFO story that kind of hit the news in Poland. And it was a fairly unique situation in the Soviet Union in general, that Poland kind of was allowed to have this kind of open ufological community publishing and talking about this research, where I guess it was more kind of restricted and not talked about in other countries in the Union. And so one of these theories was that the communist regime did it in order to kind of divert people's attention away. And it did become a major story in Poland that everyone was talking about. But again, there's also no proof for any of these hypotheses that it was a scripted plot by the regime, that he was drugged, that it was an hallucination. Another theory is offered by Polish author and researcher Bartosz Ardatowski. For him, the whole Emilchin affair originates as a prank one ufologist tried to pull on another. Ardatowski purchased Zbigniew Blania's archives from the ufologist's sister after he died in 2003. He went through his files in order to see if he could get to the bottom of this case. In 2013, he published a book, Tajne Operacje Pirali UFO, otherwise known as Secret Operations, the Polish People's Republic, and UFOs. And in this book, he outlines his prank hypothesis. Now, Zbigniew Blania Bolnar was a Lodz ufologist and sociologist that was with the University of Lodz. And he highly publicized the Emilchin case in Poland. He went to Emilchin not long after the incident took place in order to conduct an investigation that on the surface appeared to be quite professional and thorough and quite scientific. he invited a psychologist and a psychiatrist to perform tests on the lead witness and determined he was of a sane mind and good mental health. There was a variety of different tests they gave him, like these apperception tests and various other tests. And in each case, they determined he didn't really have this fantasy-prone personality. He wasn't prone to lying or making up stories, and that he, wasn't kind of deranged or mentally unwell. By all accounts, he was in good mental condition. They also subjected him to a number of medical tests. And Blania took this whole incident quite seriously. He described the results of the investigation in 2 books. One of these books, Zsemle Zsemle, Event in Emilchin, was probably the bigger book. I believe that came out perhaps in 1996. But for years, Blania didn't say how he found out about this incident in Emilchin. It was only in the book in 1996 that he actually mentions he learned about it from another Lublin ufologist, Witold Verjanek. Witold Verjanek learned about Wolski's encounter shortly after it happened from a coworker. Some claim that Witold actually knew Wolski's son beforehand, and Ardotowski says he spoke with Verjanek's wife, and that she did actually confirm this. But there's kind of a lot of dispute when it comes to this Verjanek guy. Verjanek had actually already spoken to Wolski and learned the details of the case, and recorded a kind of an interview with him, and he informed Blania of the story in a telegram on March 28th. This telegram is from March 30th, roughly 20 days after the incident. Verjanek had this habit of using hoaxes to kind of like make a point in UFO circles. 6 months earlier, he had produced fake UFO photographs that he had sent into a Polish television show, Sonda. They then forwarded these photos on to Blania, which is the local kind of the main UFO expert at the time. He was basically the Stanton Friedman of Poland. So they forwarded them on to him for consultation, and Blania and Verjanek stayed in touch from that kind of point on. About a month or two before the Emilchin incident, the 2 gentlemen had made a bet on a television program that Blania had invited Verjanek to appear on. With the hypnotist Lech Stefanski. Blania said that he would have Verjanek hypnotized in order to implant false memories of a UFO event that never took place. And Verjanek was confident that it couldn't happen, that it would be impossible to implant these memories into him. After a session during which Stefanski was successfully able to put Verjanek in a trance-like state, the Lublin ufologist did, in fact, wake up remembering those implanted false memories. Not feeling very happy about being made a fool of, he decided he wanted to get back at Blania. He was so furious after his death, in fact, that his son, Adam Verjanek, tried to stop this story from being told by Ardotowski. He felt that it was the greatest shame to his father's honor, and that he had felt humiliated and hated Blania his entire life because of that experiment. I'll point out, from what I've read, actually, that television episode never aired. So while it did happen and he was hypnotized, it was never publicly aired or shown, so nobody actually ever saw it. So again, keep that in mind. Would you be mad enough to want to pull off a hoax like this because of an on-air television episode? It said that Verjanek had a personal interest in hypnosis and himself was a practitioner, which would actually kind of make it hard to believe, right, that he would think that you could not implant false memories with hypnosis. If he was such a skilled hypnotist and qualified and knowledgeable about the field, why would he have thought that in the first place? But anyways, he decided to play back Blania in kind, and that he would hypnotize Wolski, implanting the story about encountering small green men in order to trap Blania in a hoax and later make a fool out of him when it was exposed. One might ask then why it was never exposed, why it never came out a hoax. Why did he pass up on this opportunity to make a fool out of what was supposedly his hated enemy? In fact, Blania went on to become quite famous and respected researcher because of this case. This was the case that put Polish ufology on the map and put Blania on the map as its lead kind of like researcher, and made him a major famous figure in Polish ufology, which is quite the opposite effect of what would be intended with this hoax, which would be to humiliate him and make a fool out of him. So again, why didn't he expose it? Well, Artotowski suggests that the case simply got away from Warzanek. It took off far too quickly that he lost the opportunity to declare it a hoax. It had gotten too much attention with the local media, with the press, the village, the communist regime, law enforcement, just too fast. And he lost the opportunity to expose it. And at that point, really no hoax explanation would have been bought anyways, which is kind of true. When somebody pulls a hoax, it really doesn't matter if they later come out and admit it was a hoax. At some point, there will be people that won't accept the hoax. Calling it a hoax is the hoax. And so he never did come out and explain why it was a hoax. If in fact this happened, again, this is a hypothesis. It may or may not have happened. And Warzanek sort of kind of fell to the background for many years. He was still around, still doing research. And Blania continued to kind of build this case into Poland's most famous case and famous entry into the UFO record books. But it went largely uninvestigated beyond the narrative pushed by Blania for 35 years. And to be fair, there were other investigators involved with the case. There's a guy, Christoph Drost. There was a variety of other researchers, but for most of the time, it was the same kind of narrative that Blania told from his initial investigation. And it wasn't until 35 years later, when Artotowski obtained and analyzed the primary source material from Blania's investigation, did anyone take a deeper look at the case. Again, there's also no proof for this prank theory. There's no way to prove someone was, hypnotized. And again, all these characters are long dead at this point. While it seems like a logical explanation, I personally do not find it plausible that Warzanek would hold such a grudge over such a simple hypnosis experiment. And like I said, I also doubt that he had the skills to perform this hypnosis if he truly doubted that you could implant false memories. If that was the case, he went from not thinking it could be done to being an expert that pulled it off flawlessly extremely quickly. But the Warzanek family would actually issue a statement adamantly denying this. They stated that Witold had no interest in hypnosis or any ability to hypnotize anyone. They reject Artotowski's theory, calling it nothing but scandalous manipulation. We do know from Artotowski's investigation of Blania's files that the testimony of the local boy, Adam Popowek, is now in doubt. Blania had led the boy's story in a direction that would act as confirmation for Wolski's encounter. The boy's mother had tried to inform Blania the child did not develop his story until after the incident was already the talk of the town. But Blania chose to ignore this fact and continued to investigate the boy, pushing the story in a direction that confirmed Wolski's encounter. He later on would no longer confirm his encounter. As an adult, he wished to escape from this innocent child a lie he told, and no longer wants anything to do with this case and will not speak about it to anyone. For Artotowski, though, listening to Blania's audio recordings of the investigation made it clear he was not performing an investigation at all. He was pushing the story in a direction he had decided in advance. The entire professional and credible appearing investigation was nothing but a farce. For years, this case was considered highly credible because of the two independent witnesses, which we now know do not confirm each other's story. It was also investigated in a seemingly above-board manner by qualified individuals like psychologists, psychiatrists, university professors, with various psychological tests and other aspects that would seem to give the case an element of scientific credibility. Artotowski concludes that Blania, however, did not conduct a thorough investigation and that the credibility of this case in his mind has been completely destroyed. Whatever really happened to Jan Wolski, it appears he truly believed his experience was real. He would, however, say, like some of the other cases I've covered recently, that he didn't think they were actually aliens. He thought they were foreigners. In fact, he thought the green skin may have been painted on or was a costume of some kind. And again, getting back to how this conflict information on this case, depending on what you read, some people will say that he was convinced the rest of his life that he had this extraterrestrial encounter, but other sources will say he never thought it was extraterrestrial, like ever. He always thought they were just foreigners, perhaps wearing they painted their skin, or they're wearing some sort of costume of some kind. But he believed his encounter was real, and he wasn't lying. But his encounter was not entirely, original. In fact, his encounter, his story was so common to kind of the UFO literature at the time. Researchers wondered how he could recite such a story in a town that only had 2 televisions. He did not have a television. He supposedly was completely unaware of flying saucers. He allegedly didn't even know what an extraterrestrial was or what the word meant. The only time he even saw a newspaper was when one of his sons bring one home and left it around. So he's telling a story that fit quite well with the UFO literature, which in many cases, that might be a sign that somebody's copying. However, in this case, because of the isolated nature of Wolski, that was just more confirmation that he was telling the truth, that he was able to tell a story so in line with the literature kind of at the time. But he had a story, and that's a photo of Wolski in the field and some other kind of old photos. This case did have a major impact on Polish geology as a whole. Like I said, it kind of is Poland's version of kind of like Roswell, not in the crash retrieval sense, but kind of in the popularity sense. And it had an impact on this wider culture. A short comic book that was the comic I featured in this presentation, titled Prisbiz, which I guess means the visitors, was drawn by a famed Polish illustrator, Grzegorz Rosinski, who created a very famous, was an illustrator and character creator of Thorgal. If you read graphic novels or European comics, Thorgal is a pretty famous comic, and he was the guy behind that. That comic was written by Henryk Kurta, and it was published in 1978 in Relax magazine, number 27. A documentary of this was also filmed and aired shortly after the event on September 23rd. I'm not even going to try and pronounce that Polish name, but essentially it means visitors or at the threshold of mystery. And I recommend you watch this. Eyes on Cinema has a kind of poorly AI dubbed translation version of it, but you kind of get the point, and you can watch Wolski and the little boy and his wife and everybody actually talk about it at the time, which is always interesting. And there was additional documentaries that would air in the 80s and the 90s as well. Wolski would end up speaking about his encounter in 1985 at the Ufological Congress held in nearby Lublin. And Zbigniew Blanio was there as well. I believe Witold Wrzanek was there as well. And on October 15th, 2005, a monument commemorating the alleged landing of UFOs was unveiled in Emocin by the Nautilus Foundation, which is a Polish UFO research organization. This monument consists of a metal cube balancing on top of a platform, and on it says, on May 10th, 1978, a UFO object landed in Emocin. The truth will surprise us, or the truth will still surprise us. And this monument is significant in another way because it's actually the very first, supposedly the very first monument commemorating a UFO abduction. So I guess before the Betty and Barney Hill monument or plaque was put up, before any of these other abductions, I guess this was supposed to be the first monument put up. And a Polish artist, Hubert Cherepak, also created this cool art exhibit recreating the event. He created this kind of really cool 3D model of the craft, and he put these children in these kind of black, toga head outfits and took them out to the side and did this photo set. And then he created this art exhibit where he put the photos all along the wall and has this model. And it's really cool. I like his model. He also did an exhibit involving Nazi UFOs, but they're kind of cool looking, but that's from an art perspective, but not real. And the village has embraced its kind of legacy as a UFO landing site. For many years, they've held these festivals and events near the monument. There's a time capsule there that was put there in 2011 that says time capsule to be opened in 3011. So put that on your calendars, guys, and 3011, you can go open that time capsule there. And in fact, they say about 2 to 3 people a day still kind of stop by the village to see it. Again, it's a small town. There's not really anything to do there, but people driving through town and foreigners still do stop by to see this monument. And you can see the monument yourself. It has a 24-hour live webcam. I've been watching these flying rods, i.e. bugs, fly in front of it, at night on a regular basis. And there is, in fact, a picture of the old Wolski home and one of the festivals. I believe that was a festival they had there in 2009. And they actually just had a festival a few weeks ago as well, one of these picnics, these ufological picnics at the site. Now, like I mentioned, this case was very similar to other cases in the UFO literature. And in fact, there was another case that happened in Poland just several months later, in Golina and Przyjniak or something like that. Now, this case happened on September 27th. The Przyjniak one happened the day before on the 26th. And now it's important to note that documentary I just showed you, that main one from 1978, aired 4 days before this Galena polling case. And as you can see, the entities are almost identical. In this case, they saw a guy was mushroom hunting out in a forest, and he saw, again, kind of a cuboid, kind of like craft, and these 2 small, kind of 5 foot tall entities with green skin and these overall outfits. And they were interested in his motorcycle. He showed him how his motorcycle worked and explained it. And they kind of went back in the craft, and it kind of took off. And it looked very similar, the craft did, except it was kind of, instead of this kind of whitish opalescence, it was kind of like a bluish whitish kind of color to it. And one of the other encounters, there was a school encounter that I mentioned the day before on the 26th, that again, it was described in much the same way. These children saw these entities. However, they described the entities with that. I told you Blania had suggested they put fake elements in the story in order to pick up copycats. And one of those was the webbed hands and this insignia kind of like on the chest or breast area of the thing, this kind of red symbol. And these children did report this red kind of symbol, which was in the documentary that had just aired a few days before. So Blania concluded that children case with the school children was fake, but he believed this Galena case that happened the following day with the guy on a motorcycle that was out picking mushrooms was in fact a real case. Now, as far as other corroboration in Emmelchine, I'll mention that on the day of the event, besides for that boy, there was not a whole lot of people that came forward to support the case. Supposedly, there was a loud kind of a thundering sound that was kind of heard, almost kind of like a sonic boom, like a vibration that they said they felt emanated from under the ground at about the same time this encounter happened. And many of those stories actually wouldn't even end up coming out until 30, 40 years later when people went and reinvestigated people. Apparently, they had told the television news crews and reporters at the time, but they did not apparently want to go on camera or their story to be told publicly. And in 2017, in fact, starting actually around in 2005, people also reported hearing a kind of a buzzing or humming or transformer sound kind of in the area. And in 2017, on November 5th, witnesses were driving down the road in the area and saw this kind of cloudy, misty-like object that has a sort of similar shape to the object that Wolski encountered. And they reported hearing a kind of a buzzing or kind of a transformer-like sound kind of as well. Another kind of amphibian kind of frogman kind of case is this Loveland frogman case that happened on May 25th, where this guy, Robert Honeycutt, is driving in Loveland, Ohio, and he encounters these entities that while they're not exactly like the emerald-chain entities, they are described as amphibian-like, and they have that hump or lump kind of like around the neck. That hump or lump was also reported in those September encounters in Poland, and in a few other encounters that I've run across. In fact, there's another famous case also in September 1978, the Udine, Italy case, also known as the Little Oriental Airman case. That again is a small creature in a form-fitting toga head kind of outfit that had these oriental features. That the skin was not, it wasn't a green entity like these Polish cases were, but the description of the beings shared a lot of kind of familiar similarities. And so that's basically what I got for the presentation. There's a lot of other various kind of weird details about this case. One involving a supposed devil stone in the area that has some sort of relation. Supposedly these stones are UFO navigation beacons, and they're put on these kind of like grid lines like around Europe. And one of these stones just happens to be where Wolski's encounter was. There's another story about the TV crew that was there in 1981 was doing an experiment with a pendulum, and in front of the whole crew, this pendulum supposedly just vanished. Supposedly there's a smell of sulfur relating to his when he was in this craft. One source claims there was this acrid smell, kind of like sulfur, and that it got so bad in his clothes that for days, like he couldn't even wear them because they smelled so bad of the smell. But again, I could only really find one source that kind of said that. So there's a lot of interesting tangents and stuff and places you could go with this case. And if there's something I didn't get to, we will have a discussion episode next week, and you can ask me because I'm sure there's lots of things I missed. But I believe that should do it for now.
I'm going to talk about the connection between consciousness and UFOs. So this is actually based on a article I wrote for my blog, ufologiescorrupt.com. And the article itself is called The Role of Consciousness in the UFO Mythos. And it sort of goes into many of the connections. Now, what is consciousness? Probably no one knows quite yet what it is. And it's been obviously a philosophical point of contention for millennia. But it seems to have quite a lot to do with UFOs, and people might not at first assume that, but it actually does. And the ways in which the topics have kind of been linked or connected are very multifaceted, as much as the UFO topic itself is. So let's see. So a lot of what actually underlies belief in space visitors, although not all UFO stories are about space visitors, some are about interdimensional entities, etc. But what underlies it is largely a dissatisfaction with the standard categories of material science and a desire to extract from it, along with the experiences had by many people, a kind of spiritualist meaning or interpretation that links us as individuals and as a species to the wider cosmos. And even though many believers see things in broadly materialist terms and are concerned with the mechanics of like interstellar space travel, the possibility of reverse engineering supposed alien technology, the humanoid shape as a configuration of alien biology, and sensor confirmation of UFOs from Navy fighter jets, it's still true that much of the focus in ufology revolves around the question of consciousness and our connection to the universe. So this stream of thought has got a very long pedigree going back to the contactee movement, which is a sort of broad brush term, but basically it's kind of after, I guess it grew up around 1947 or a little bit after that, and then into the late 1970s. And that talked a lot about the Space Brothers as the aliens who are trying to help us. But it's also been more recently concretized and taken to really absurd lengths in works like Making Contact, which is a book from 2021. I really recommend people read this book. It's completely unhinged, but it's still nicely summarizes kind of the beliefs out there in the spiritualist side of ufology. It's got contributions from many people, including Nick Pope and others, but it's pretty unhinged, just so people know. But something close to a total rejection of rationalism and materialism is espoused in those sorts of works. The question of consciousness has long vexed philosophers and scientists. There's no universally agreed upon definition of the term, and it can also denote different things. So subjective self-awareness, qualia, sentience, a sense of self and personhood, and even knowledge generally. So why the UFO genre has become so infused with the question of consciousness and its different meanings is a fascinating and important sociological and cultural question that's worthy of serious study. So here are some of the ways in which the issue of consciousness, however defined, manifests itself in UFO and alien stories and accounts. So UFOs are purported to be capable of doing things that make a purely nuts and bolts approach untenable, and in which a spiritual or immaterial element is seen to be necessary. Like apparitions, UFOs can disappear or materialize. They can engage in aerial maneuvers that are deemed impossible for physical craft. They can merge or split apart, and they can change shape. While some interpretations see these aspects as support for the interdimensional hypothesis and the related control system hypothesis, which I'll talk about later, in relation to Jacques Vallée, some think that the craft is spiritual or immaterial capsules or manifestations, or themselves as spiritual conscious beings. For example, fallen angels regularly make the rounds in YouTube comment sections about UFOs, and it's sometimes difficult to clearly delineate what believers think counts as immaterial and spiritual or interdimensional, but sometimes these concepts are even fused together. Consciousness is imagined as a field permeating the universe. Such musings date at least as far back as Helena Blavatsky's writings, such as this offering from The Secret Doctrine. There's Blavatsky, who was the co-founder of Theosophy. So in her book, The Secret Doctrine from 1888, she said, Parabrahm, the one reality, the absolute, is the field of absolute consciousness, i.e., that essence which is out of all relation to conditioned existence. Once we pass in thought from this to us absolute negation, duality supervenes in the contrast of spirit or consciousness and matter, subject and object. And those sorts of sentiments or ideas have really carried over into New Age thinking and sometimes into ufology. The UFOs often mimic the behavior or instructions of the observers, or even anticipate them. Famous example of that involves Father William Booth Gill and his mission in Papua New Guinea in 1959. This is a fairly famous case in ufology. And in that case, him and his members of his mission reported seeing some sort of craft with, I think, 4 beings on it who were waving back to them as they did to the craft. And that's a pretty common thing, that the UFO or its occupants are sort of mimicking the behavior or anticipating the thoughts of the witnesses. This case is hauntingly conveyed by religion scholar David J. Halperin in his excellent book, Intimate Alien, The Hidden Story of the UFO, which I really recommend that everyone read. That provides a sort of Jungian interpretation of many cases, including the William Booth Gill case. David Fravor, a former fighter pilot and the most well-known personality involved in the US Navy Nimitz encounters, also relates how the Tic Tac seemed to anticipate his moves. Longtime ufologist Jacques Vallée posits that UFOs present us with symbols that rearrange our conceptual categories of the world and allow us to transcend those categories, which are tied to logical and rational, and in his view, constricting systems of thought in order to get to a higher truth or logic, a meta logic, which he uses in the sense of a meta language. By linking up with the meta logic and latent meaning of the UFO, we are better able to appreciate our place in the cosmos. Vallée also suggests that this meta logic operates as part of a control system in which interdimensional intelligences spur the progress of human consciousness and social evolution by presenting it with images and motifs that resonate with the concerns of the age. For example, space aliens in the current age of space travel, and perhaps compel us to engage in socially transformative action. This idea is expressed in the idea of the wow aspect of UFOs, which sort of is made to prompt us into doing something good in the world and to engage in social change. So that idea is also conveyed in Grant Cameron's chapter in the aforementioned book edited by Alan Steinfeld. The chapter is called UFO Disclosure and the Theory of Wow. Quantum mechanics is regularly invoked in a cavalier and dubious fashion to promote the idea that consciousness is non-local and that the universe is not temporal but relational. Another view espoused by Vallée, who hails from an information science and cybernetics background, and he's also got some leanings towards Rosicrucianism, in which information and meaning are connected across what we normally experience as discrete spatial and temporal intervals. So in Vallée's view, kind of the universe may not have a true temporal aspect. That's just how we experience it, as a sequential series of events. But in fact, it's really a relational universe where everything's related to everything else. And if we can decipher that, we can maybe understand the UFO behavior better. These sorts of ideas are also rather similar to those of the British, formerly far-right extremist David Miat. Here he is. He actually converted to Islam after the 2001 attacks. He praised the Al-Qaeda attackers, but he later renounced violence. But he was initially a far-right kind of white supremacist type who had some ideas about UFOs. And he was sort of espousing something a little bit similar to what Vallée is saying. He talked about how you could tap into like a platonic realm in which time and space don't exist, and use their own bodies. People can use their own bodies as nexions to undertake supernatural feats, and maybe use this for space travel as well. So maybe the UFOs are using these nexions. And according to Miat, we might also be able to power the spaceships and explore the universe using willpower as a form of Faustian magic. Also linked to quantum mysticism is the currently fashionable New Age woo about vibrational frequencies, self-actualization, 5D consciousness, and all of that stuff. These notions have a long pedigree going back to the contactees, many of whom were also heavily invested in New Age ideas in the Californian subculture. There's a little chart there showing kind of this idea that's popular in many New Age circles. I'm sure you've heard of vibrational frequencies. So the easy traction that these tropes garner in our society, it may well speak at least partially to a pattern of pathological narcissism and indifference to the veracity of scientific claims. Not to denigrate people, but I think some of it is down to that, which also makes it unsurprising that many New Age types go in heavily for anti-vax and fake news claims, a worrying trend that Jules Evans has detailed in his brilliant series on spiritual eugenics. And I really recommend that people check that out, that series. There should be another slide, by the way. So importantly, Evans is a practitioner of Western spiritualism himself, but he's taken it upon himself to highlight and call out the more disturbing and toxic currents within this tradition. Yeah, there's one of his articles about spiritual eugenics. The very same hyper-atomized society that we inhabit produces narcissistic tendencies and extreme alienation that we then seek to resolve through narratives about cosmic connectedness, which itself often possesses the germ of narcissism. For instance, notions of being adepts of superintelligences or of being chosen by ET, like the starseeds. So like people try to kind of resolve the narcissism by engaging in something that is itself grown from that very narcissism. So the idea that you're special and that you're connected to some sort of greater cosmic consciousness or that you're chosen by ETs. Brian Sentes of the Skunkworks blog has made the insightful remark that, ironically, the Enlightenment may be partly to blame for these tendencies, emphasizing as it did the need for individual thinking and a natural distrust of authority. There were some streams within the Enlightenment that were distrustful of democracy, but I think most of them espouse democracy in some way. But we're now seeing a lot of kind of authoritarian ideas permeating in society and posing a threat to democracy. But you still have this kind of hyper individual take where reality is just whatever you think it is. We see that with the unthinking reflex is often harbored by like Trump or anti-vaxxers, rejecting all medical scientific knowledge pertaining to COVID, and because it hails from a distrusted authority in the form of the scientific community. So that's individualism that's gone too far. Self-aggrandizing notions of being an adept or an initiate of higher intelligences are the ineluctable outcome of the dichotomy and tension between hyper-atomization and the need to confirm or affirm individual agency in a world of information overload and soulless capitalist consumerism. Elitist and eugenics promoting strains run deep in New Age practice. The starseeds see themselves as specially attuned beings who can guide humanity, or at least themselves, to a new, more enlightened age. There's another article by Jules Evans. UFO and alien encounters are associated with altered states of consciousness, with witnesses, contactees, abductees, experiences regularly reporting loss of bodily control, missing time, a transference of information and or dialogue between themselves and the ufonauts via telepathy, deep feelings of euphoria or terror, a sense of intimate connectedness to existence, and sometimes with the ufonauts themselves, a linking of past, present, and future, and a sense of ascending and descending through vistas of space, sometimes at the same time. Many reported experiences are highly reminiscent of or are outright examples of hypnagogic and hypnopompic hallucinations. Whitley Strieber, who became famous, became perhaps the most famous purveyor of consciousness-related narratives about otherworldly beings after publishing his Communion book in 1987. He talks about his experiences, but those are largely probably just hallucinations. He himself alludes to the dreamlike quality of his encounters with the others, right? And skeptical observers have long drawn attention to the close fit that his experiences bear to the aforementioned types of hallucinations. Channelers have long played a role in the UFO mythos, including among the contactees. See the book A's for Adamski, The Golden Age of the UFO Contactees, 2018 by Adam Gorightly and Greg Bishop. Really, really good summary of all the contactees. And he describes they describe the contributions that each of them made. But many of their ideas are still current, okay, so in ufology. So with many people claiming to be able to channel the minds of ETs, or even to be the same self-described ETs, at least during a kind of seance period. And there's also, in my article, there's a link to a UFO documentary from 1980 called UFO Syndrome. And there's a guy called Brian Scott who is channeling an alien he calls Voltar. At least he claims that he's doing that. Channeling as a ufological item is a continuation of its presence in cosmically themed esoteric practices, such as theosophy, which alluded to ascended masters concentrating their consciousness through the portal of Venus, and John Ballou Newbro's OASP, A New Bible, in the Words of Jehovah and His Angel Ambassadors from 1882, which was an obscure work that was popularized by Ray Palmer in the 1950s and detailed a galactic hierarchy in which Jesus traveled the cosmos in an ethereal ship. Brad and Francie Steiger, who have for decades advocated a consciousness-based, spiritualist, and interdimensional take on UFOs, and have written books on the topic, as well as appearing in a number of TV specials, have also been proponents of the channeling aspect as a source of communication with the extraterrestrials. Similarly, the CE5 narrative pushed by disclosure activist Stephen Greer, in which one can communicate with ETs through meditation, preferably in the desert. The type of information one can glean from the ETs does not seem to be of an eminently scientifically verifiable sort. And it's sort of like the stock standard, aliens just want us to love each other, which we've been hearing for decades. Those sorts of tropes, of course, go back to the contactees and the Space Brothers narratives. There should be another slide, please. Yeah, there's Stephen Greer. The UFOnauts are imagined to be, or at least have the ability of transmogrifying into incorporeal entities able to pass through walls or engage in sort of ghost-like behavior, and sometimes harbor overtly benign intentions, and other times more intrusive or inscrutable ones. They can traverse, whether naturally or through some sort of technological means, the material world and the subtle realm, as John Mack termed it, or something in between, taking us with them on this journey. The UFOnauts seem to need us for something, perhaps to complete themselves by engaging in the emotions and joys in which we humans are capable of feeling. So maybe that's a kind of story about ourselves that we need to find ourselves, but it's being told through a kind of alien narrative. And Whitley Strieber talks about this as well in his stories. The UFOnauts are often described as bringing guidance and a model for a new way of life that is not ecocidal. This awakening of a cosmic evolutionary trajectory will connect us with creation, the source, God, etc., and we will have achieved cosmic brotherhood once we awaken and reach this new level of consciousness. As Vallée warned in Messengers of Deception from 1979, that's been updated since then, but there was a initial edition of that book in 1979. There are also some worrying tendencies in which, in some of these narratives, namely that the Space Brothers were often imagined to be racially homogenous and ruled by a totalitarian elite, promising humanity utopian bliss. It seems that many people today, given the vicissitudes of democracy and its seeming aimlessness, wish to anchor themselves to something more organic, even at the loss of liberal institutions and the rule of law. Ironically, Vallée has continued to push his own Forteana well past its welcome. Among many in the New Age crowd, evolution is seen as a teleological unfolding of progress, which is something like the term's original meaning, and has itself been turned into a religion in some quarters. Right after Darwin's revolutionary insights, some saw and some continue to see evolution as an opportunity for humanity to consciously imprint itself into the cosmic story and to achieve greatness out there in the cosmos, elevating its own intellectual and spiritual quality in this great forging process. Here again, we can note the dangers of eugenics ideas, which with some groups of people being seen as worthy of participation in this grand evolutionary game, and others should be left by the wayside of history. David Miat's fascist cosmic imperium is an example of that. And the contactee movement became increasingly interwoven with psychedelics and altered states of consciousness in the 1960s and 70s. There's actually a picture of one of the conventions, the Giant Rock Interplanetary Spacecraft Conventions. That picture was taken from 1957. And this was like a convention that was held from 1954 to 1977. And many contactees went there, and many people interested in UFOs, these sorts of questions went there, and they exchanged ideas, and it was kind of like a Woodstock of ufology. But yeah, it became more psychedelic into the 60s and 70s. And the message of the contactees itself was arguably a premonition of the hippie counterculture in that and also other regards, aiming as it did to get away from standard restrictions of Middle America to expand consciousness. Much of the talk one hears among New Age proponents about tuning into vibrational frequencies originates from this period and overlaps with a desire to reach blissful states of communion with the aliens who was seen or felt to be contacted on an expanded universal spectrum that could be tuned into like a radio. Contactees like Bernard Copley wrote about hallucinogenic drugs and the link to ESP. The rock and roll music scene, including Pink Floyd, also tapped into this counterculture, expressing a fascination with flying saucers and the possible connections to drugs. UFO theorists like John Keel, with his super spectrum hypothesis, would also draw a link, and as would famous DMT psychonauts like Terence McKenna. Yeah, there's Terence McKenna. The pineal gland as the third eye or gateway to the subtle realm was invoked. This trope has a long pedigree and continues to this day. A version of panpsychism is sometimes evoked in UFO accounts, with all of existence being conscious and our minds seen as small pieces of a much larger universal mind. This is a theme explored in the aforementioned Making Contact. One can imagine, and many experiences believe that they have partaken in, tapping into this mind, this universal mind, to access a hidden library of knowledge, instantly gaining wisdom and esoteric truth. This was also a theme in the writings of Helena Blavatsky and continues today in the garb of quantum mechanics, but is also seen in stories like those related to CIA and Army psychic spies, reputed to be capable not only of spying on Soviet nuclear installations, but to catch glimpses of an ancient Martian civilization. The latter vision by Joseph McMoneagle, his book there. So he was involved in these psychic spy programs. He reported that he could see back in time to Mars, and that there was a civilization of kind of Nordic-looking people living there. This particular story by McMoneagle was latched onto by the co-founder of the alt-right, Jason Reza Georgiani, to argue that there was a time-traveling secret civilization that set up shop on Mars by traveling back in time hundreds of millions of years ago, only to have to ultimately evacuate back to Earth during the Cambrian period due to a nuclear cataclysm on the Red Planet. So it's not unusual to find these sorts of esoteric and alien-themed stories on the political far right. So these beings, according to Georgiani, later acted as overlords to various terrestrial civilizations such as the Inca. While invoking the Nordic blonde trope, as McMoneagle did as well, and while his musings do carry a flavor of 1990s neo-Nazi yarns about defeated Third Reich, I'm talking here about Reza Georgiani again, that his musings carry a flavor of those 1990s neo-Nazi stories about defeated Third Reich officers traveling back in time after World War II to found the ancient civilization of Sumer, and therefore gifting humanity with its first civilization. To Georgiani's credit, he does at least describe the Nordic overlords as tyrannical and an impediment to human progress. And he thinks that they're still ruling over us. And he's also disowned the alt-right, but he still kind of dabbles in racialist sort of eugenic sounding ideas. So that's still problematic. And all this Forteana and esoterica, which is really just stories. Experiences often report heightened levels of consciousness, deeper understanding of the world, and psychic telekinetic powers after returning from their time on board an alien craft or being in contact with the Ufonauts. This has been taken up by promoters of the Skinwalker Ranch saga, with their talk of a hitchhiker effect, in which like paranormal events follow you around after you go to the ranch. Eric Davis, who was involved in the ORSAP program, reports that as well. But it's also been a theme that was espoused decades ago in the writings of Jacques Vallée, who has invoked Uri Geller as an example of a genuine experiencer bestowed with extraordinary abilities after he supposedly encountered an otherworldly presence. Now, Carl Jung, who was a famous Swiss psychoanalyst, he's often evoked in ufological discussions, not least because he himself wrote an important tract on flying saucers in 1959, titled Flying Saucers, A Modern Myth of Things Seen in the Sky. So he espoused the view that flying saucers evoke the archetype of the mandala, symbolizing in its circular form the need and yearning for unity during the Cold War context, where the two superpowers were risking nuclear obliteration. Alien visitation-themed films from the period in which he wrote also invoked the dangers of nuclear warfare. One can also apply, though how empirically profitable this is to do remains an open question, a Jungian analysis, as David Halpern, the aforementioned author of Intimate Alien, does with various UFO cases like the Belgian Wave, Strieber's Pantheon of Creatures, including the Greys, stories of Lemuria and the Hollow Earth, the John Lennon and May Pang UFO encounters, and the Betty and Barney Hill case, among others. So he's got a lot of examples in his book where he applies that Jungian interpretation. Esoteric fascist currents often invoke the black sun. There's going to be a slide there showing, that's just an eclipse, but that sort of paints the picture for the black sun, which is imagined to be this sort of mystical object calling out to the Aryan race. And it's sort of hidden by the real sun, or it's opposed to it. And there's different variations on this, but it's a kind of a cosmic icon for many fascists. It's sort of giving off a cosmic energetic emanation. And the subjugation or destruction of all other races in a race war is often linked to this black sun, and an end to what they see as the current Jewish-dominated Kali Yuga by replacing it with an alchemical clique, the next turn on the cosmic cycle with the Satya Yuga or Golden Age. Miguel Serrano, the Chilean esoteric Hitlerist and practitioner of Kundalini Yoga, was an adherent of UFOs, which he saw as being powered by a metaphysical energy source. He also claimed that it was possible, through an act of sheer will, of turning oneself into a flying saucer. He actually thought that Hitler himself turned into a flying saucer at the end of World War II. Importantly, Serrano also invoked Jung, though to say that he took the latter's archetypes too far would be a massive understatement. For Serrano, who actually struck up a friendship with Carl Jung, but ultimately that didn't last because, well, among other reasons, Jung was not a Nazi. But he said that Jung had merely psychologized the literal supernatural race memory of pagan gods in his essay Wotan in 1936. Returning to flying saucers, it's ironic to note that the circular form can come to encapsulate unity, but also act as an icon for deranged racial supremacism. Brian Sentes advances the notion that UFOs represent a collective dream, though not in the Jungian mold, of the so-called advanced societies who project their technophilia into the UFO by seeing it as a vehicle implicitly embedded with the solutions to our problems, because we think in terms of technocratic solutions. So, look at all the talk about in the UFO circuit about free energy and reverse engineering the flying saucers to get a power source that will solve all the world's problems, right? So it's like a technological fixation projected onto the UFO. And we also see aspects of this sort of technophilia and cosmic frontier thinking in the Martian space Nietzschean fantasies of Elon Musk, Peter Thiel, and other tech bros. In her book, American Cosmic from 2019, Professor of Religious Studies Diana Pasulka discusses, although she doesn't outright endorse, the idea that certain highly innovative people throughout history, including important people in the American and Soviet space programs, have been in communication with otherworldly presences, and that they're sort of downloading information into their minds. Proponents of this view speculate that the true creative spark of genius comes about by allowing these intelligences to just sort of come to you and let them conjure the eureka moment in your mind. The solution to the pertinent problem only seems like a spontaneous epiphany, but in reality, according to them, it's a gift bestowed by, these intelligences. Notably, notions of being attuned are sometimes linked to genetic predisposition, a theme alluded to by Gary Nolan and John Ramirez, these guys here. And Gary Nolan's a scientist, and Ramirez, I don't know, is he a scientist? He was in the CIA, but he's really big now on the UFO circuit. But he's also invoked this idea of being attuned or genetically predisposed to getting messages from the other, super intelligent beings. This is arguably kind of a subsumed version of biblical angel-human mating fables or epiphanies from God. The aforementioned starseeds are another variant of these tropes, though by most accounts, these people do not seem to be that much of a cut above the rest of humanity. The utilization of hypnotic regression by UFO and alien abduction researchers. And there's going to be a picture of, I think there's going to be a photo of Bud Hopkins. Maybe I didn't add that. But he was really big into using hypnotic regression to sort of bring up memories, suppress memories about UFO or alien abductions. It's, of course, a methodology that's replete with many problems, and it's been severely criticized by skeptics and mental health professionals. But some UFO people continue to use it. And it's obviously a severe ethical breach because you're telling people who need help that they're being abducted and abused by ETs. UFOs are indeed centrally about consciousness, I think, but not for the same reasons that the literalists, as we'll call them, would make it. So they believe that there is some cosmic connection with aliens or interdimensional beings that are connecting with us through consciousness, but I think it's just that the question of consciousness is where these stories are coming from. So maybe in something like a Jungian style or other subconscious dynamic involved in many cases, in which the UFO encapsulates various meanings that erupt from the subconscious and find articulation in the visual and other modalities of alien spacecraft and contactee or abduction experiences. The symbols and themes therein relate to issues ranging from death, ecocide and planetary extinction, the bioinformatics and computer revolutions, nuclear war, personal and social alienation, emotional trauma, sexuality, and indeed the very nature of consciousness and the subconscious. The more exotic candidate explanations invoking ETs and interdimensional psychic fellow travelers are themselves worthy items for further exploration within a psychosocial paradigm and should not be dismissed as mere items of silliness, but they should be seriously studied for what they tell us about ourselves as conscious, intelligent beings. The role of fiction also deserves a mention. The underlying urges and drives that motivate the UFO stories are very much terrestrial, but they can still be imbued with elements derived from science fiction and fantasy, though these elements themselves could be reflections of social stresses and anxieties. Stress, hallucination, misidentifications, confabulation and embellishment, cult brainwashing, the suggestibility of the mind, pareidolia, neurobiology, and psychosocial processes round out the rest of the field and make literal ETs superfluous. So we don't need ETs or anything exotic like that to describe or to explain what's going on. Although we don't yet have all the answers, we're getting there. So, whatever consciousness is, it's an important topic and it's going to continue being debated for centuries. And I think it's still going to be an element of ufological narratives. Anyway, that's pretty much what I wanted to say. Back to you, Rachel.
Any bird can be seen as a UFO, but whether UFO or not, that bird is still a bird. I am Rachel Nelson, or I guess what I mean is that I was Rachel Nelson, but now I am a digital representation of Rachel Nelson, The me that spoke these words is not the me that you hear speaking these words. Between the vast distances of space and perhaps even time that I am consciously speaking and you are consciously listening to me, much has happened. Many representations were made, and I eventually turned into a flying saucer. The John F. Kennedy Space Center lies on Merritt Island in Brevard County on the eastern coast of Florida, just south of the town of Merritt Island. But just as the town of Merritt Island is not itself Merritt Island is not in fact an island at all. It's not even the words Merritt Island, which are used as a name for this place, just as all of the words I am saying right now are used to represent things that the words themselves are not. But more fundamentally, Merritt Island is a peninsula and not an island, and it's a place long predating and therefore existing without any external dependence on the name Merritt Island. It's just that that's what people call it. And really, the Kennedy Space Center used to simply not be there. Not that long ago. Just a few generations ago, it didn't exist at all. The Kennedy Space Center also sits just across the Banana River from Cape Canaveral, where a Space Force base is located, formerly an Air Force base, and the site of Air Force rocket launches already throughout the 1950s. It was from Cape Canaveral that the first U.S. satellite, Explorer 1, was launched in 1958. These two locations are best known for their many space launches since this time, and the role that they played, for example, in the Apollo moon landing missions. Apollo 11, the most well-known space mission in history, was launched from the Kennedy Space Center on Merritt Island, and SpaceX launched their first Starlink satellites from Cape Canaveral in 2019. In 1962, NASA acquired the lands where the center would be built. At this time, much of this land was occupied by wild salt marshes to the north, periodically flooded by the Banana and Indian rivers, and modern citrus farms to the south. And before the late 1940s, Cape Canaveral would have been dominated by sand dunes. Because of the mosquitoes that once swarmed Merritt Island, people mostly avoided living there, specifically North Merritt Island. This area still contained wild salt marshes into the middle of the 20th century. The brackish marshlands were home to broom grasses. The local dusky seaside sparrows used them for shelter and building nests. The duskies were the most distinctive of the 8 subspecies of the seaside sparrow, a small bird that lives in salt marshes along the eastern coast of North America. The duskies' distinctiveness came from their black and dark brown feathers, making them much darker in color than other seaside sparrows, not to mention their unique call. The Duskies were endemic to Merritt Island, Cape Canaveral, and some small regions just across the Indian River and near the St. Johns River. And in their heyday, they likely numbered in the thousands. Merritt Island was also inhabited by human hunter-gatherers thousands of years ago, and in more recent times, the I people who formerly inhabited eastern Florida, before being decimated by Spanish settlers. But the dusky seaside sparrow likely diverged from other seaside sparrows hundreds of thousands of years ago, at least according to a mitochondrial DNA study that was conducted in the years just after the bird went entirely extinct. If this study is correct, this means that long before humans ever even inhabited North America, the dusky seaside sparrow's ancestors already long inhabited the same broom grasses on Florida's eastern coast. But the Dusky's population began to rapidly decline in the 1940s. Eager to develop the land by getting rid of the mosquitoes, mosquito fighters repeatedly sprayed North Merritt Island with DDT, a synthetic pesticide now known for its negative impacts on ecologies and its ability to remain in the environment for decades. Rachel Carson's 1962 book, Silent Spring, discusses the harms of DDT and other synthetic pesticides in detail. Carson writes, for example, quote, "And the sparrows that flit through the shrubby understory of the woodlands and forage with rustling sounds amid the fallen leaves, the song sparrow and the whitethroat, these too have been found among the victims of the elm sprays." Unquote. This was the first major impact to the dusky seaside sparrow, likely in part by killing off insects they relied on for food, and also by contaminating their food supply. In researching this piece, I relied heavily on A Shadow and a Song, The Struggle to Save an Endangered Species, a 1992 book by Mark Jerome Walters that chronicles in grim detail the slow demise of the dusky seaside sparrow throughout the mid-20th century. NASA, in collaboration with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, caused the dusky's population to further shrink throughout the 1950s and 60s. This was again in large part because of a war waged on the vast swarms of mosquitoes that spawned on North Merritt Island, a constant hassle for Air Force and NASA employees. The marshlands were separated into impoundments using dikes, and these impoundments were then flooded to kill mosquitoes. But this also destroyed the broomgrass habitats that duskies relied on. Another major impact was the building of multiple highways that crisscrossed Brevard County and cut into the nesting grounds and habitats of the few duskies that still remained. A population known as Big Colony, numbering in the dozens, was only discovered by biologist Brian Sharp in 1968 near the St. Johns River and across the Indian River from Merritt Island. This population would disappear in the following decade as its habitat was destroyed by highway construction. Walter's book is largely a history of how NASA and the Fish and Wildlife Service engineered wetlands for their own purposes and without any care for the sparrows at all, while conservationists found their efforts actively squashed at every turn, even as the duskies' population kept shrinking. Walters writes, quote, "A solicitor's opinion confirmed what some people within Fish and Wildlife had silently suspected all along. Ever since 1973, the service had been violating the Endangered Species Act by colluding in destroying dusky habitat. It seemed that nothing less than the sparrow's extinction could put Fish and Wildlife's malversations on legal ground. Then, critical habitat would no longer be designated, for nothing would be left to protect." Unquote. By the 1980s, the dusky population was fewer than 10, and all of the known surviving duskies were taken into captivity. At first, they were tended to at the Santa Fe Zoological Society, but then they were moved to Discovery Island at Disney World in Orlando, Florida. Formerly Treasure Island, Discovery Island was repurposed as a themed island attraction containing exotic plants and animals from around the world. Here, an attempt to breed Duskies in order to eventually reintroduce them back into their native habitat was undertaken, after previous attempts to do so were actively hindered by the Fish and Wildlife Service in the 1970s. At Disney World, however, the facility was concealed from visitors. The plan was to backcross Dusky males with females of another subspecies, Scott's Seaside Sparrow. In other words, they would crossbreed these two subspecies to produce sparrows with more Dusky genes. These would then be bred with male Duskies to introduce more Dusky genes to each successive generation. While in theory this would have certainly worked, and it even did succeed in producing several sparrows with mostly Dusky genetic makeup, the project was beset by bureaucratic stalling and successive small tragedies. Over the years, each Dusky as well as each Scott's sparrow died. In some cases, this was because of rat infestations. In some cases, the Duskies accidentally killed themselves by panicking and burrowing into crevices that caused the bird's own demise, and others simply died due to old age. The project to try to restore the Dusky sparrow population through backcrossing took many years, slowed by efforts of the Fish and Wildlife Service, so that by the time that a breeding program was underway, all of the Dusky males that survived were already reaching old age. The last surviving one, a male called Orange Band, died alone in captivity on Discovery Island in 1987. Disney World was built at Epcot, which Walt Disney originally slated not to be a theme park at all, but a futuristic utopian city, an experimental prototype city of tomorrow, or Epcot for short. There, people were to live in a futuristic city, but this ultimately didn't happen. Instead, Epcot was turned into a theme park, a place where various spectacular worlds and even representations of our own world are simulated for anyone willing to pay for a ticket to go inside. Discovery Island was designed as a place to showcase the many spectacular marvels of Earth's life, sort of like a zoo. And in this very place, the last individuals of the Dusky Seaside Sparrow literally died. Though still owned by Disney, the island was shut down as an attraction 12 years later in 1999, and it's been closed since, much of it essentially returned to the wild. Meanwhile, Kennedy Space Center and the Cape Canaveral Space Force Base still persist, and they are themselves cultural simulations. Of course, nobody in NASA or the US Space Force say that these places are theme parks or think of them as simulations. They do have real impacts to the local environment, as I've discussed, and the rockets that launch from these places do really launch and really go up into space. So we can say they exist in the external environment and can cause things to happen objectively. But they are also places that are entirely constructed by humans, using large amounts of steel and concrete, as well as entirely maintained by humans for human purposes, and they are both separate from and a replacement for the places where they are built. In order to create these places, humans had to completely alter the place that was there before. And once these places are abandoned by humans, they will lose all human significance, to deteriorate and gradually recombine with local geological and ecological processes. Perhaps someday, some other subspecies of seaside sparrow might evolve around Merritt Island and the St. John's. On top of the artificial nature of the Kennedy Space Center, it is supported by American visions of dominion over Soviet Russia and futuristic dreams of human space exploration. Yet, as Sarah Scholes argued in her Scientific American article, critiquing human space habitation, which Louise talked about in the pilot of this show, humans aren't well suited for spending long periods of time in space or for living a life on an inhospitable world like Mars or the Moon. And designing and building the infrastructure, spacecraft, and space missions to do so is extremely expensive, while also putting a toll on the Earth's ecosystems and climate. Considering all of these costs, can we really say that the Kennedy Space Center truly represents any realistic vision of a sustainable future? It's not as though the loss of the Dusky Seaside Sparrow or the salt marshes of North Merritt Island and the surrounding regions were the only impacts that humans ever had to North American wildlife. A little over a century ago, the eastern United States was densely populated, with vast flocks of passenger pigeons and Carolina parakeets. Can a person today imagine what it would have been like to see such a U.S., one densely populated by native parrots and flocks of pigeons that stretched for hundreds of miles? I highly recommend Atlas Pro's videos on the various bird and animal species, as well as some subspecies that went extinct in Nearctic North America during the last couple of centuries, and how each was driven to extinction by European settler culture. The various species and subspecies of birds that have disappeared from our skies in recent times invariably disappeared because of human settlers seeking to exploit local wildlife or to develop the land. Birds were hunted to extinction, beset by plagues brought from the Old World through chickens, or killed off simply because their habitats were destroyed through land development. Some of the most spectacular birds of North America went extinct during this period, like the ivory-billed woodpecker and the great auk. One spectacular bird, the imperial woodpecker found in the western Sierra Madres of Mexico, is thought to be extinct, but is still listed as critically endangered. But if some imperial individuals have survived to this day, then they are legendary, intelligently controlled, flying objects. Under the right circumstances, spectacular birds thought to be extinct may hypothetically even be regarded as UFOs by people that witness them and are unable to identify them. In a 2022 article from The Mirror, Nick Pope was quoted as arguing that human drone technology has become so advanced that drones are now designed to mimic animals. He speculates, therefore, that extraterrestrials, by comparison, might simply use seagulls to spy on us. But in reality, birds themselves are significant on their own terms, without any requirement to think of them in terms of military defense or alien technology. Birds have their own intelligence, strange appearances, flight behaviors, sounds, and effects on terrestrial animals, and they exist external to humans and otherworldly beings. As I've speculated above, some UFO sighting reports are also sometimes explained by people as sightings of birds. This explanation was given by some during the Lubbock Lights flap of UFO reports that happened in the area of Lubbock, Texas, around late August of 1951. One witness reported what he saw was plovers. I have often wondered over the arrangement of light sources in the Carl Hart photos. Could we be seeing a photograph of birds here? This is something I might go into another time. The CIA explanation for the famous Tremonton, Utah film was birds, and watching the Tremonton film, I feel like it could easily be a video of seagulls, but I'm not really an expert on interpreting UFO footage. According to researcher Lauren Gross, NICAP reported that a disc-shaped UFO was witnessed at a launching of a Polaris missile from Cape Canaveral in 1961. The disc was observed through binoculars by aerospace engineer Mark McClelland, among other witnesses, and was also locked onto by the missile tracking system, according to George Eberhardt's UFOs and Intelligence, a Timeline. It is very unlikely, of course, that the Dusky Seaside Sparrow was ever mistaken for a flying saucer, that a flying saucer was ever actually sighted at Cape Canaveral at a missile launch, or that birds are being used by ET to spy on people. But I think it's worth extending my ideas from last episode here. Much like flying sea foam, the Dusky Seaside Sparrow could in theory have on occasion been spotted by humans and remained unidentified to them. It is technically possible for the Dusky to have become a UFO at times. Perhaps they used their seemingly unremarkable nature to their advantage, and even deceived some G-men. Not only that, but the Dusky in their native habitat of broomgrass-laden salt marshes on the eastern coast of Florida can serve as an alternative mythology to that of crashed saucers and alien humanoids. This would be a useful myth, if only to highlight that NASA's massive building projects on Cape Canaveral and Merritt Island, as well as related public works projects to connect these bases to the mainland, played an instrumental role in displacing the Dusky Seaside Sparrow and destroying their entire habitat. I wonder what this must have been like for the Duskies themselves. First seeing their homes and all of their kin disappear while they themselves struggled to survive, and then being carted off by giants to live in captivity. But we know at least that it must have been like something for these once living birds. But whatever the case, the life and experience of the Dusky was not something that interested the US space program or the Air Force during the Cold War, nor even, for that matter, the US Fish and Wildlife Service. As Walters argues, they failed to see the bird, let alone the bird's habitat, as something intrinsically valuable on its own terms. They preferred instead an artificial refuge built for ducks, which could be hunted and then would therefore draw in tourists. NASA, much like most of the American public, likely didn't really even have an awareness of the sparrow until after they had already made huge changes to Merritt Island. While Fish and Wildlife at least preferred ducks over Duskies, NASA preferred space rockets. But what makes rockets more important than ancient local sparrows, let alone birds in general? They were living beings, much like any of us. Walters, who grew up in Brevard County, writes, quote, "The transmogrification of Brevard County from a jewel to a trinket is nearly complete. Once the old-timers are gone, there will be little memory of the wild county, the straw and emerald tapestry of North Merritt Island, of the crystal stars set in indigo nights above the St. John's, before lights spilled into it from runaway cities. Worst of all, one day there will be no memory of the black and white shorefinch that once lived there." Unquote. The Kennedy Space Center is an environment entirely constructed, a product of human culture, and this was a major factor in the disappearance of the Dusky. While it functions as a space launch, it also functions as a simulation. I don't mean that it's the Matrix, but it is sort of like a holodeck, or even like Disney World. It is an engineered and constructed environment in the external world, in many ways both a figurative and literal representation of human endeavor, set aside for specific human purposes while enriched with both specific and broad representational meanings. Yet not everyone agrees that NASA is the most useful way for the US to invest their money. Even at the time of the space race, writer Kurt Vonnegut famously lampooned, on multiple occasions, the phallic nature of space rockets launched at Cape Canaveral, for example in a satirical short story about launching seamen into deep space. And poet Gil Scott Heron criticized NASA's Apollo program from a social standpoint in his poem Whitey on the Moon. Yet, despite the critics and satirists of the space program, Kennedy Space Center persists as an American spectacle of rocketry and futuristic space-age culture, even while it is also an artificial replacement for what was once there. The marshes and dunes of the St. John's, Merritt Island, and Cape Canaveral, similar to how rockets separate humans entirely from the surface of the Earth, sometimes even as far away as the Moon, the space spaces from where the rockets launch are separated entirely from the land where they are built. When a person goes to a space base, they find an artificial environment made and sustained by human wherewithal and state funding. Nowadays, rockets launch amid the birds who visit and live on Merritt Island, but before the rockets, there was a much longer age when the dusky seaside sparrow flew there. They were just a sparrow, a small bird notable only as a subspecies endemic to a small region. The dusky wasn't driven to extinction because they resembled flying saucers. They weren't big, incredibly fast, or able to, say, interfere with electronics. They didn't have telepathic abilities or a habit of abducting people. If anything, they were driven to extinction because they did not resemble flying saucers. I wonder, what secrets has this now lost sparrow taken to the grave? In this case, only the Earth can provide disclosure. All right. Thank you so much, you guys. I really enjoyed both of your segments tonight.
Thanks.
Very good.
I mean, I really do enjoy all of. I always enjoy them, even if I don't always agree with them. I always enjoy them. And I do.
That's the book I mentioned.
Yes. It's got Mr. Joe Simonton Pancake Man in it.
Mm-hmm.
That's his real name.
That's what I'm going to call him. Yeah. There's another book that you mentioned, Young.
Mm-hmm.
Got it right here.
What? What?
By the way, I was looking at because when you were talking, Jeff, about the little green dudes encountered by the Polish farmer, it made me think of the Soviet frogman, because this book by Thomas Red,
Active Measures,
it talks about an exercise in 1967 or 8 by Soviet forces in Czechoslovakia, involving scuba divers, and they were sort of planting disinformation. It was part of a disinformation operation, but that just sort of reminded me of that. So maybe there was a Soviet aspect potentially, but I don't want to.
It's very possible. Yeah, I mean, like I said, that was one of the main kind of theories, was that it was these, like, they kept calling them scouts, but like I think they don't mean like Boy Scouts, like militia, like kind of like military people is what we're talking about. And they kept thinking that they were scouts either performing a prank on him. And when he first saw them, he basically kind of thought they were either hunters or militia scouts or whatever, like that were camping nearby and that had set up a tent and that were out and about. And so like that's like what he kind of thought it was at first, and that's kind of what other people thought it was, is that it was just the local military doing some sort of operation, and potentially even a prank on him, you know, at the time.
Yeah.
No proof. They never admitted it if it did happen. So,
but somebody should, maybe somebody has, but look at the geography of that area. Like, are there many lakes or ponds there where you could have some sort of scuba diving activity? And also the mushrooms. Are there any mushrooms that grow there that could be potentially hallucinogenic?
I'm sure there are. I haven't looked specifically, but it's like I say, it's a foresty area, lots of brush and trees and whatnot and plants, and it was a farming village. The whole area was, like I said, it was a village of about 72 farms. You know, part of this commune. That's kind of in the, I guess, the southwestern part of Poland. I'm not sure about actual like swamps or lakes in the area. I'd have to go look at some maps, but yeah, it's an interesting theory, and that's kind of like that guy's book I mentioned, that Bartosz Artotowski. His kind of whole book is kind of putting it in the context of the Cold War and the Soviet Union. That's why his book's called Secret UFOs and the People's Republic of Poland, or whatever it was called. But again, it's in Polish, and I don't have the book. I found it like 60 pages sample of it online. Then I kind of translated various pages to look up some information, but it's very interesting. Frogman. And, you know, that would make a whole lot of sense with, you know, this hump they keep talking about, right?
And the face painted as well.
Yeah, and in fact, there's a case I didn't mention that happened a year or so later in a different area of Poland, in a village called Hel, which is actually near the beach. It's kind of like this peninsula on the ocean, this village, where this lady saw, again, these people in these black overalls with what she said looked like a lump kind of around the back of the neck area, and kind of painted faces, and very similar encounter to this other guy had. And this one was, like I say, actually near the beach of the ocean, like on this peninsula as well. So it's entirely possible that's what some of these people were seeing, I guess, is these frogmen. And they were called frogmen in multiple of the sources. Like, that's what they call them, is frogmen. So it may be less amphibian than people actually, less literal frog, more frog people than people realize. And as I said, he this whole time he says that he thought they were just somebody from like a different nationality. Wolski believes the entities whom he encountered were quite simply just men, but men of a different nationality, perhaps Chinese. He says the appearance can be explained by like paint on their faces. And
the Soviet Union was a vast landmass with many cultures and ethnicities. So maybe this farmer saw somebody of like a Asiatic background and sort of extrapolated from that. Yeah,
and as we know, the most kind of like aquatic frog feature of it, this alleged webbing between the hands, which in some of the reports that I had read that reported the webbing said that he didn't get a close enough look, but they could have been gloves of some kind. But then I also read that Bolnia introduced that as a fake part of the story, that there was no actual webbing between the fingers in the first place. So there really isn't anything about them that doesn't scream human.
Yeah.
So.
Interesting. That's very interesting.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, on that note,
call it a show. It's the longest episode yet.
And for our final story tonight, in the greater Cincinnati area, lightning struck a golf course in late May, leaving a radiating branching pattern of marks on the ground. A video of the strange pattern went viral after being posted to TikTok by staff member Jason Herrick of the Ivy Hills Country Club in Newton. A nearby golf hole was later reportedly moved to the center of the pattern by club staff. I think this strange pattern is a clear message. The weather hates golf. Before we go, if you enjoy this show, we would like you to please consider subscribing to our channel, Ufo Sunset. Please also hit the like button and hit the notification bell icon if you'd like to get notified about upcoming videos. And come and join our cozy and intimate live chat. A great plus for joining the live chat is that you can give us constructive feedback live on the air, especially if we make any factual errors. You can also join our Discord, a temporary link to which can be found in the episode description. Here at Ufos, our political and personal views are not the same, and the work of each of us is independent work. Personal views or positions expressed in individual pieces are not necessarily those of Ufos, who is not a person and has no views, or myself. Please be sure to check out our respective content. I can be found at the Earth YouTube channel. Visit Luis Cayetano's website, ufologiescorrupt.com, which is, you can find this piece there, actually, the piece that he did tonight. And you can find Jeff Knox's daily posts on history and the science of UFOs on Twitter or Facebook. Jeff Knox spends all of his time studying UFOs, fact, and he doesn't make any money off of it. Please consider visiting his Patreon page and becoming his patron. Thank you, Jeff. Thank you, Luis. Thank you, Dr. Brigham, for joining the chat. Wonderful to see you here. Thank you to all of our lovely viewers and listeners.
Thank you, guys. Thank you, everyone.
Thanks.
Have a good night, boys. All right.
You too.
And in the words of the disc, I don't want to believe. I just want to dance.